What's going on, guys? It's Cimoooooooo. So today I wanted to bring to you a video discussing hand traps because I feel hand traps are one of the most polarizing issues that currently face our game, and I see in a lot of forums like Reddit and things like that where people just make the argument that, oh, hand traps are the worst thing to happen to this game, or hand traps are just a plague upon existence and they wish hand traps never existed because that's the sole reason the game is ruined. Well, I'm going to make the opposite argument. I'm actually going to say that hand traps are not the problem because I feel there's a lot of misconceptions and misattributions because there's a lot of other things that you can attribute to the fact that the game is in the position that it is, and if we didn't have hand traps, the game would be in a much worse position than it currently is viewed in now. But before we get into that discussion, I do want to give a big shout out to my newest patrons as always. So big shout outs to Liam, Oliver, as well as Vuth. And if you guys want to contribute through Patreon to support me and the channel, then check out the Patreon link in the description below. But let's get into today's discussion. Now, hand traps, you guys have to remember, have taken on different forms over time, and I think I'd make the argument that over the past 5 years, Yu-Gi-Oh! In terms of power creep has evolved exponentially compared to how it's evolved in the past. And I think if you were to graph that on a chart, I think a lot of people would agree, because I feel like power creep has accelerated to the point, especially in these last 5 years, that the game has just taken on a whole new being. And you have to remember, we've had a card like Max C for an incredibly long time, but basically in terms of how Max C is applied in the current metagame has evolved based on the new cards that have been injected to the game, the way the meta has shifted, and plus a myriad of other different factors. You have to remember that back when Max C was first introduced into the game, Max C was a lot different than it is today because the game was so much different. I mean, there was cards like Max C, you had Effect Veiler, you had other hand traps like Gores and Trigodia, and these were actual viable options because they were used in the battle phase, but actually, the battle phase actually mattered because of the fact that games lasted more than 2 turns, and games weren't solely dictated by the fact of that there was only going to be like the opening hand and how those opening cards were going to play out. So these were actually very viable options. The interesting thing as well is that you didn't win or lose by whether or not you drew a hand trap or if you got hit by a hand trap in the opening turn. The thing is, with cards like Max C and Effect Veiler specifically in this instance, if you got hit by something like Max C, sure, your opponent might go +1 at most, but back then in Yu-Gi-Oh! You were actually pretty much done with your turn, and there wasn't really any way that you could keep going on, whereas in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! You have the potential to keep going like +6, +7 if you want to give your opponent all those cards, but that's kind of the big, you know, contrasting argument with Max C is that, well, it's fair because I'm going to get all these cards if my opponent's going to special summon into Oblivion, but that's kind of really taken away from the identity of Max C and really has changed how a card like that functions. Same thing goes for something like Effect Veiler. If you hit your opponent with Effect Veiler, they weren't going to end on an extremely powerful board, but even if you didn't have the Veiler for whatever they were doing, the board that your opponent was going to amass wasn't going to be anything that was just utterly unbreakable. Now, it might be difficult to defeat, but by comparison to the unbreakable boards that we've had to deal with in modern day Yu-Gi-Oh!, I think that has been one of the biggest shifts when it comes to this game. And break my board, you know, mentality is kind of what I want to go into next, because frankly, the game has evolved to a point where you either open a hand trap if you lose the die roll, or you just flat out lose. Because take Spiral. Spiral is a perfect exemplar in this format because Spiral, especially full power Spiral, back before we had the initial ban list where Quick Fix and Drone got hit to 1, you saw back in YCS Dallas and YCS Prague that 29 and 27 of the top 32 decks were Spiral, and that's with people maining anywhere from 9 to 13, if not more, hand traps in an attempt to stop a deck from like Spiral from going off. And that's the thing. You have to realize the fact that basically, if these hand traps weren't in the game, then it would actually be a lot worse, because then if you lost the die roll, then you were just basically fucked and you had nothing that you could do to stop your opponent. You have to realize that even with a deck like Spiral being a perfect example in this instance, even if a deck like Spiral gets hit and goes away, that's not going to exactly solve the problem. And the reason for this is because the OCG is going through this renaissance at the moment. The thing is, Spiral Resort got hit to 1, as well as Quick Fix and Drone on the OCG ban list. They also got Ancient Fairy Dragon hit to 0 as well, which is a pretty significant hit. However, Spiral, even though it's still playable, has definitely taken a seat in the backseat because you've seen all these other decks pretty much entering the meta now that Spiral is no longer the threat that it is. But the interesting thing is, okay, so if Spiral's out of the meta, you'd expect people to play less hand traps, right? Wrong, because what's happening is the other decks that are entering the fray are just as oppressive and just as powerful and are establishing boards, or in the case of Plant FTK, just killing you outright, that if you don't open that hand trap, you're going to be at a severe disadvantage by comparison. There's a deck like Zephyr in the OCG, which has taken a huge just portion of the meta now because it's able to open on a board that has 2 forms of negation, and basically that's all you need if you're going first to be able to stop your opponent and just win the game outright from there, especially if they don't have a hand trap. And don't even get me started on Plant FTK, because Plant FTK is back in abundance and people are playing a new version which involves Link monsters, especially due in part to the Link Vrains pack, pretty much providing all the tools that the players need to perform this FTK. And once again, if you don't have that hand trap to stop the Plant FTK, you're basically just fucked and you're gonna lose the game anyway. So even though a deck like Spiral is pretty much completely out of the meta at this point, you're still seeing people play 12 to 13 hand traps because it's necessary, otherwise they're not going to be able to play the game, and that's no fun. I think a lot of people would make the argument that the thing that makes Yu-Gi-Oh! So fun is the level of interactivity that you have on your opponent's turn. There's no other card game, I would say, apart from something like Magic the Gathering, that really offers that level of interaction during your opponent's turn. I mean, and even Magic the Gathering has a resource system. The only resource you're limited to with Disruption when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the amount of cards that you have at your disposal. There's nothing else really holding you back other than that. So the thing is, the game doesn't actually have to be like this, because I want to take you guys back to Zodiac Format. Now, I know a lot of you guys still have Zodiac Format leaving a nasty taste in your mouth, but here's what I want you to keep in mind. Back in Zodiac Format, we basically had the same hand traps that we do now. We have Ash Blossom, we had Ghost Ogre, Max C, we also had stuff like Gamma and Droll and Lockbird, but the interesting thing is, how many hand traps were people playing on average during Zodiac Format? On average, it was actually about 6 to 7 hand traps, and that was typically a combination of something like Max C, Ghost Ogre, and Ash Blossom. And believe it or not, Ash Blossom was actually a suboptimal choice because Ash Blossom in the Zodiac Mirror match actually wasn't that good, because you weren't really hitting anything that was that valuable, and you were typically taking a minus in order to use that Ash Blossom. Ash Blossom was very prevalent because of the fact it was very strong against your True Draco matchups, because they had cards like Demise and things like that that made Ash Blossom a much better choice in comparison to run. So the thing is, in a format that was basically dominated by Zodiac, you would think that we would be playing as many hand traps as we are now, but we're not, and that's because Zodiac wasn't necessarily this break my board format that a lot of people refer to. The best thing that you basically could amass playing against Zodiac, especially going first, was ending on a Trident, and then maybe having a couple back row. The only exception to this is the fact with Fusion sub combo of Zodiac, is that's where things got a little bit crazy, and that's where the break my board mentality came back into it, because your opponent was able to amass anywhere from like 3 to 6 cards utilizing the Fusion sub combo, and that meant that they were able to draw not only hand traps, but also normal back row like Solemn Strike and things like that, and that's what kind of made it very unfair, because especially in a very resource intensive mirror match like the Zodiac mirror match, it put the player at a severe disadvantage if they didn't go first, and also if the player going second did not have a hand trap to stop the player going first. What's interesting is that if you monitor the types of hand traps players use at any given moment, I think that kind of gives a very good indication of the current current health of the format, because take it for instance with Zodiac, we had Ash Blossom, Ghost Ogre, Max C, that was pretty much what everyone was using. But when we entered Fusion sub combo Zodiac, that's when people started pulling out cards like Droll and Lockbird, because basically people just wanted to deny their opponent from being able to draw all those cards and be able to stop them from gaining all those resources that the Fusion sub combo provided. Same thing goes when it came to Spiral. People started playing Droll and Lockbird because it basically said end your turn when it came to Spiral and didn't allow them to just build their unbreakable board and actually gave the player going second a chance. It's interesting that when a card like Droll and Lockbird enters the format, that's kind of when the format is in like emergency panic mode, because we've seen that in the past as well with stuff like Dragon Rulers and Spellbooks, because we just want to deny our opponent from being able to amass all these resources so that we have zero chance to come back. And then when Psyframe Gear Gamma enters the format, I think that's when it gets even more absurd, because now we're playing hand traps to counter hand traps, because we're just at a point where the game has just gotten to a point where we need to just stop the hand traps from being able to either allow us from going off, or we need more hand traps to stop our opponent from being able to go off, that Gamma is our next best option. It's really interesting when you kind of look at the evolution of hand traps as well as in tandem the evolution of the game itself, because I feel like the more we've evolved into this break my board format, or I'm just going to make the biggest board I possibly can going first, the issue is we need these hand traps to actually give the players going second the ability to fight back and make interactive Yu-Gi-Oh! A thing again. Hand traps are not the problem. The decks and the archetypes that Konami keeps injecting into the game that basically enable and inhibit this play style of just making and just shitting out the biggest board you possibly can are the root of the issue. And until Konami changes their ways and decides that they're going to go back to a more interactive and a more long-term version of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where games lasted longer and went beyond turn 3, then that's when we're going to start seeing the change. That's when players are going to start scaling back on the hand traps, and that's when Yu-Gi-Oh! Is going to return more so to its roots and actually have a good back and forth. But until then, just keep in mind that hand traps are not the issue, and that even though it is discouraging that sometimes these hand traps are really expensive. I mean, Ash Blossom's really expensive, Droll and Lockbird's really expensive. I mean, for the average player, this is a lot of money to be spending on these cards, but do keep in mind that as much as you may hate these cards, they are a necessity and a check and balance that help keep the game relatively healthy, at least for the time being. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think when it comes to hand traps and whether or not you think they are the problem with this game or not. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. And if you found this video insightful, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.